The Dirty Cats of Boggle Hole. Chapter 1. Welcome to Boggle Hole. It was a hot, lazy afternoon in early summer. The forest was alive with a feeling of breathless anticipation. The sunlight danced through the trees, and you could hear the crackle of twigs and the rustle of leaves as many animals went about their business in the forest. Joe led the way along the path, and Emma strolled along slowly behind him, letting her eyes wander. She was always keen to see what was around, and looked at the trees on the far side of the path. Her mind, however, was elsewhere. It seemed such a long time since lunchtime, and she was so hungry. Funny place, she thought, this Boggle Hole. Boggle Hole is up in the north of England, right on the east coast. Nick, Tim, Joe and Emma and their dog Ellie were on holiday with their mum and dad and staying at the farm just at the top of Boggle Hole beyond the forest. They had never tired of seeing the beautiful view across the top of the forest as it led down to the beach and the sea beyond. As soon as they pulled up in the car, despite the weariness of travel hanging over them, they all demanded to be allowed to go straight down through the forest to the sea. Mum insisted that they had lunch first. Secretly, Emma had been pleased at this, as she was very hungry after the long journey from the south. They had been enclosed in the car for hours. Mum and Dad told them not to be long, as they wanted to settle in at the cottage, and then to drive into Whitby later for the world-famous fish and chips, which they all loved and had been looking forward to the whole journey. After a very rushed lunch, they had set off, thinking that from the way it looked, the sea was not very far down the path through the forest. However, when they had walked for a little while, they realised it was much further than it seemed. Nick and Tim had gone tearing off ahead with Ellie, as they always did, climbing trees and running through the bushes, and as usual, Joe and Emma, being a little younger, stuck to the path and played their own games as they walked. Joe turned to Emma. "Come on, Em. We've got to get down here quickly, as Nick and Tim are probably waiting for us." Emma sighed. "Well, it's all right for you, but you're never as hungry as me, and I just can't wait for tea time. What do you think we can have?" Joe didn't hear the last question, as he was staring intently at the path ahead. Just as it went round the next bend, he stopped. "Em, what do you make of that?" Emma looked and tried to seem interested, although she had no idea what he was talking about. "What?" she asked. Then she saw it. The small, dark shape huddled at the side of the path ahead, just under the bushes. At that point, it moved. They both froze and looked at each other. "What is it?" Emma whispered, looking a little scared. "I'm not sure, but don't worry, I'm sure it's harmless." He tried to reassure her, although he himself was a little worried. Just then, it turned to look at them, and they experienced the most peculiar feeling. As it began to stare at them, they began to feel quite dizzy, and even a little sleepy. Its eyes seemed to be looking right inside their heads. Afterwards, they described it as a bit like pins and needles in your head. At that moment, there was a shout and a loud crashing through the bushes as Nick appeared, holding a large stick in front of him. "Hey, what's up with you two?" he asked. "Where's Tim?" Joe and Emma looked back at the path. It, whatever it was, had gone. Did you see that? Asked Emma. What was it? Joe demanded of Nick. What are you talking about? He asked, looking around. The animal, or whatever it was, down on the path ahead. Emma began to cry. Hey, what's all this? Now come on, don't be a silly girl. There's no need to cry like this. I'm sure it was nothing. Maybe a fox or something. There are lots of them round here. Let's go and have a look to see what the fuss was about. Nick took Emma's hand as they walked slowly down the path. Emma, who was more than a little afraid, held Nick's hand tightly. As they approached the corner, Joe explained to Nick, "You see, it was very strange. As we were looking at it, it started to look at us, and we couldn't take our eyes off it, and it felt like we couldn't look away. I've never felt quite so odd. I felt quite dizzy." Yes, that was it. I felt very dizzy, as if I wanted to lie down and go to sleep," Emma exclaimed. They reached the point at which it had been by the side of the path. Nick, who always took the most practical view of things, bent down to look for any evidence that may be there. As he looked, he thought he saw some paw prints that looked like, well, they looked like cats' paw prints. This was impossible, he thought, as they were in a forest, and there were no cats in a forest. He began to explain to Emma and Joe. Look, it was an animal of some kind, maybe a fox. Here are its paw prints. However, as he said that, the prints seemed to disappear before his eyes. This is impossible, he thought. Am I seeing things? He decided not to explain this to Joe or Emma, as they were more than a little worried already, and there was no need for additional concern. He looked again, and the prints had gone completely. "So where's Tim?" asked Emma. "I don't know. I thought you might have seen him." "No, we haven't seen either of you since you ran off," Joe added with a trace of resentment. "I'm sorry," Nick replied, knowing that when he and Tim went off, it always worried Joe slightly. "But you were so much smaller and can't always keep up with us." "What time is it?" asked Emma. Her mind had gone back to tea. Nick realised this and felt relieved, because he was always concerned that Emma, being the youngest, had given him the most responsibility, knowing that if she got upset or something, Mum and Dad would worry about it. 5:20. I think it's time we went back up, as this path goes further than we thought. Mum and Dad will want us back for tea as soon as possible, because we have to go to Whitby to get our fish and chips. "What about Tim?" asked Joe. "Of course," replied Nick. "We'll find him first. We're not going to leave him here for the night, are we?" Both Emma and Joe shuddered at the thought of being in this forest alone at night. Although the strange creature had gone from Emma's mind, Joe was still a little uneasy about the experience and hadn't forgotten about it. "Tim!" shouted Nick. "Tim! Where are you? We must go back now." There was no reply, and Nick was unsure what to do. Of course, he wouldn't let Joe and Emma know that he was worried, as this would upset them. "Right," said Nick with an air of confidence. "Let's go down here and see if Tim is hiding here in this group of trees." He hoped that Tim was hiding, and that he would suddenly jump out with a cry and surprise everyone, as he often liked to do, just to show that he was better at hiding than anyone else. They walked towards a group of very old trees to the right of the path. As they got closer, they could see that the trees were in a large circle. There was a very old tree stump in the middle of the circle, which seemed to have been cut down. As they approached, they saw that sitting in the centre of the tree stump in the middle was a small black and white cat. As they walked closer, they could see that the cat was busy licking its paws and generally preening itself. It was a very strange thing to see a cat in the middle of a forest, let alone one that seemed to be so relaxed it was just washing itself, as if it was the most normal thing in the world to see a cat in the forest. They all stared in disbelief at this most unusual cat. "Look at that cat," whispered Emma. "What's he doing?" "He's washing himself," Nick responded. The moment they spoke, The cat turned and looked at them. As the cat's eyes met with theirs, the same feeling of dizziness came over them, and they all slowed as they walked towards the tree stump. It felt as if their legs were made of jelly, and they were finding it more and more difficult to walk or even stand up. Each of them felt as if everything was moving in slow motion, like a slowed down video. They snapped out of it as what happened next truly shocked them. The cat suddenly lifted its head, looked at them all, and it spoke to them. To say speak didn't seem quite right, as they were aware of a voice, but they couldn't exactly hear it. "Who are you?" it asked in a slow, lisping, lazy voice. "Nick, Joe and Emma," Nick replied, faltering at the amazing sight in front of him. "Who are you?" "Why, Biggles," he replied with a very strong lisp. This, together with the fact that he spoke at all, made the whole situation seem rather ridiculous, and Nick began to feel that perhaps it was in some kind of dream. Finding a cat in the middle of the forest was surprising enough, but then to have the cat start to talk to you was unbelievable. All three of them were astounded by this cat. "We've lost our brother, Tim. Have you seen him?" Nick asked the cat, feeling more than a little silly talking to a cat, let alone asking it the whereabouts of his brother. "Is he a little younger and shorter than you, with dark hair?" "Yes," replied Nick, startled that the cat seemed to have identified Tim. "Then I have seen him," he said with certainty. "Where?" demanded Nick, a little louder than he intended to, but his increasing concern for Tim and his unease of this strange situation had got to him. He was unable to help himself. "Oh, he went down there." Biggles gestured vaguely with his paw. "He was going—" "Going where?" demanded Nick, interrupting Biggles. "Let me show you," he lisped, and at that he leapt neatly off the stump and slinked towards them. "Hello, Biggles," said Emma, and went to stroke him. Her curiosity, especially where animals were concerned, was legendary with the family. She was always being warned not to approach strange dogs and to stroke them without asking first. However, her logic was clear. If the cat could talk, then who could you ask? The cat itself, of course. "May I stroke you?" Emma inquired of Biggles. At that, Biggles turned and looked at her. It was suddenly as if a fire was burning in her eyes. Emma's surprise made her jump back and nearly fall over. "Hey, what's up?" Joe shouted and grabbed her arm. "Come on, Em. Let's go with this cat and see if we can find Tim." Emma took Joe's hand and said nothing. Biggles walked slowly past them, without looking at them, and carried on down the path, deeper into the forest, towards the sea. They all looked at each other and followed behind him, not knowing where he would take them. However, they had to find Tim, and this strange cat seemed to know where he might be. As they walked down the path, every so often, Biggles would turn and look at them over his shoulder. He certainly had a very superior air about him. Nick wondered what sort of cat this might be, where he was from. Joe must have been reading Nick's mind. "Where do you think he's from?" Joe whispered to the others. "I don't know. I haven't seen any houses in the forest, and I've never seen a talking cat." "Who does he belong to, then?" asked Emma, a little too loudly. "I don't belong to anyone." Biggles had stopped and turned to face them. "For your information, I am my own cat. I am too dirty to be a possession of anyone." He sounded a little cross. The three of them looked at each other and said nothing. Joe looked as if to say, "I think it's very strange. Maybe we'd better not say any more." Emma, however, seemed to be a little encouraged by this, and seemingly unshaken by her attempt to stroke him, quickened her pace and began to walk just behind Biggles. "So where do you live?" she asked him. Biggles seemed to be very pleased with this question, and replied, "I am the place where I live. That is to say, the place where I live is wherever I choose. If I want to live somewhere, then I live there." "Whatever do you mean?" Emma asked him. He turned to face Emma. "Where do you live?" he asked her. "Well, Emma was a little taken aback by the question. "I live at home with my mum and dad, Nick, Tim and Joe and Ellie." "And tell me, where do you want to live?" "Well, at home, of course." Emma didn't see quite where this was leading. "There you are," he exclaimed with satisfaction, as if he'd suddenly discovered that he'd taught her that 2 and 2 equals 4. "You can live anywhere that you choose, but you choose home. Within you is the power to choose your destiny, and yet you allow your destiny to choose for you. You must be careful not to let destiny choose too much for you." "I'm not sure I understand you exactly," Emma faltered. "Never mind," he said with an air of finality that told her the discussion was over. "What did you mean when you said that you were too dirty to be possessed by anyone?" Emma was determined to find out as much as she could about this very strange cat. "As a matter of fact," she added, "you look very clean indeed to me." Before Biggles could begin to answer, Nick and Joe had caught up with them. Nick was encouraged by Emma's conversation with the cat, and he asked Emma, "Can you see Tim yet?" "No. Can you?" "No. Excuse me, Biggles." Nick had felt a little uncomfortable addressing the cat, especially one with such an odd name. "But how much further do you think that it might be before we find Tim?" "It will take as long as it takes, and we will find him when we find him," Biggles replied. It was obvious to Nick that this animal, although blessed with the ability to speak, for some reason could only communicate in such riddles. It was very difficult to understand him. The forest seemed to be getting darker and darker. Secretly, Nick was worried that actually it was getting darker as it got later than they had intended to be out. By his reckoning, they should be quite close to the sea now, and they should be able to see it. He was just thinking this when they heard what sounded like the sound of a wave crashing against the rocks. "Are we near the sea?" Joe asked Biggles. "We must catch the door before it closes." Biggles seemed to mutter to himself, and then he said louder for them all to hear clearly, Yes, Joe, we are near the sea." He sounded a little impatient now. This was the first time that Biggles had directly addressed any of them. It was very strange the way he'd chosen to address Joe in this way. "I do hope that Tim hasn't decided to go swimming," said Emma. "Don't be silly, he hasn't got his towel with him," said Joe. "That's never stopped him before," said Emma. "Come on, you two, stop arguing. Let's try to find Tim." Nick turned back to the path and realised that Biggles had disappeared completely. "Where's he gone?" asked Joe. "I don't know," said Nick. "Maybe he's just round the corner." "He can't have gone far. If he's gone, how will we find Tim?" Emma asked in a worried tone. Nick was thinking exactly that when there was a sudden and a very loud, terrifying scream from what sounded like the bottom of a very big cliff. They all froze.